Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I was introduced to a fascinating professor, individual, and author. Dr. Andrea O'Reilly is her name. She is a professor of the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, the coordinator of bridging programs for women at York University here in Toronto. She's published over 30 books on motherhood, including Maternal Theory, Essential Reading, which has sold more than 3,000 copies, and it's used as a course text in university classes around the world, and numerous others that we'll undoubtedly review over the day. She really does have a message, though, that it's about motherhood and feminism, and that they're not antithetical. And so I think that's going to be an interesting conversation as we really delve into Dr. O'Reilly's studies, her books, her experiences, and some of the lecturing that she does. Dr. O'Reilly, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So, you've presented your research at over 100 conferences in 24 countries. Why are people interested in this topic of motherhood and feminism?
Well, great question. I think they're interested because for so long it has been very invisibilized, if I can use that word, marginalized, ignored. I would say in mainstream media, but I would also say in academic conferences, publications. I ran a research center for over 20 years, based in Toronto, but we did conferences around the world, in Italy and Barbados and Greece and Ireland, and thousands of women probably over those 20 years came. And I just heard, and the conferences were on motherhood, various things, whether it be mothering in work or mothers and sons and mothering in health or mothering in the environment, whatever they may be. I heard from, women globally, their anger, their frustration, if not their despair about how their work, their research, their activism on motherhood, just they hadn't found a place for it. It was ignored or trivialized, whether, they were doing a paper on motherhood and work. People in work studies, weren't really that interested. So I think people are interested because it has been so sidelined on the mainstream, popular, and academic spaces.
I've interviewed a couple of people recently that have been focused on being feminine, not feminism necessarily, but the right to be feminine. And some people have described this as sort of a movement to the right or conservatism or back in time, and other people have said no, it's actually a movement to freedom, that women don't want to be forced into being like men and being career oriented. They want to have the right to be a mother or stay at home. And we've heard these comments about stay at home girlfriends and other things. And some people have said this has all happened because of COVID and the fact that people were forced to stay home, and some people liked it. What do you think about that issue, that maybe feminism made it difficult for females to feel comfortable being feminine and playing motherhood and stay-at-home roles?
Yeah, again, I think it's a very good question. And I think part of the problem is there are many different types of feminism, right? And I think kind of mainstream feminism, which we sometimes call career feminism or mainstream feminism or liberal feminism. Some of that feminism, yes, I think very much devalued the work that women do in the home as mothers. They call them stay-at-home mothers, which is quite offensive. They're not at home to begin with, they're working and raising children, as certainly one of the most important jobs we have. But other types of feminism have been there for mothers, have embraced mothers, have put mothers' needs, concerns at the forefront of their feminist agenda, but not enough, right? So I agree. And the term I have coined is that motherhood is the unfinished business of feminism. That a lot of the concerns that mothers have were not really on that agenda in the second wave in the 60s. So in response to that, I created this concept of what I call matricentric feminism. It's a bit wordy, but it's a mother-centered feminism. And I coined that term in 2016. But since then, there's been a real growth, very exciting growth of publications and activism in feminism that puts mothers at its center.
Matricentric feminism. You published in 2021 Theory, Identity, and Practice. Please explain again, what is matricentric feminism?
Yeah, it's wordy. I probably should have come up with something a little bit easier on the tongue. I mean, matra means mother and centric means centered. So it's a mother-centered, mother-focused feminism. And in my work, I actually have another book coming out in September of this year, which is an anthology on matricentric feminism. We call it The Mother Wave. And it's myself and 24 other people. The book you mentioned is just my monograph. But this other book's coming out where, 24 people around the globe are picking up this concept and thinking about it, what it means to do feminism as a mother, to be a, what does it mean to be a feminist as a mother, and what does it mean to enact that in practice, activism, policy. And so what mother-centered feminism is, I'm going to spend a book on it. So in a sentence, I mean, basically I argue, and I'm not alone in this, that being a mother is different than simply being a woman, that many of the needs or concerns, challenges, whatever you want to call it, are unique to being a mother. So we don't exist just as women, we exist as mothers as well. And so our needs, our concerns might be different than simply as a single, unpartnered woman. And what would those needs be? Well, clearly, if you're a mother, what you would put on the table is important, I think would be different. Things you'd put on the table is perhaps childcare. You might say, to combine work and raising children, I need better childcare. Or you might put on the table better maternity leave, or you might put on the table better health care, or you might put on the table flex time. So when I'm saying that the way we don't just live as women, we live as mothers. So a matricentric feminism puts the concerns, the needs, the wants, the desires of mothers at the forefront of feminism. Now, it's not the only feminism. It's not to replace mainstream feminism. It's to complement it. But it's to say that, and I believe that despite 50 years of feminism, mothers still remain disempowered. While women might have made inroads, mothers, it's the stalled revolution, we're calling it, because the gains have not happened for mothers as they've happened more generally for women over the last 50 years.
So I interviewed someone who was a director of communications in the Prime Minister's office. I won't tell you which Prime Minister, but in the Prime Minister's office, and very powerful, individual, very influential individual. And she decided that she wanted to stay home and have children, and she felt like other feminists looked down on her and thought she was a sellout because she wanted to stay home and take care of her children. And she said, but yet this is the most rewarding time I've ever had.
Yes, and again, I've written about that in my work. Now that happened to me. My eldest will be 40, so that my experience of that is quite dated. But I am hearing the same thing, and you've just shared that story, which reiterates it. That I was often treated like a sellout, that I'd gone over to the other side. That what's a good feminist like you, wasting your time, raising a child, and worse, but yet a son, right? Now, I would say that, I wouldn't say that's every feminist by any means. I don't want to overstate the case, but I do think we need, feminism needs to, take more seriously, put more at its center, the important work of mothering. Now, it's not the only work that women can do. Most mothers are also in paid labor force in Canada. I believe the stats about 70%. We're one of the highest countries. That 70% of mothers are in the paid labor force. That's the reality. And it might not be a choice. It might be a necessity. We know the affordability crisis we're living through right now. So the reality is that most women do have to work outside the home. Now, a few that are privileged that can stay home, then they should be applauded and, respected for that decision. So it's about choice, but it's also recognizing that not all women have that choice, and what choices are there, and how can we better support the choices that mothers may make.
Now, this isn't a motherhood choice, but it's that I want to ask you about. It's a femininity choice. But I wonder if you've got a point of view on that. I've interviewed several people recently that say that they don't feel comfortable or that society pressures them to not be feminine, and it comes back to the sort of Hillary Clinton idea of you got to wear a pantsuit and sort of look a little bit masculine or alpha. And it came to the fore, interesting enough, from some comments that Oprah Winfrey made at the Grammys. I'm not sure if you're a fan of the Grammys or watched that show, but Oprah Winfrey was talking about Tina Turner. And Oprah Winfrey said that Tina Turner always told her, get dressed for dinner, put on your makeup, and show up because you'll feel better. And this person said, some people think that's being a Stepford wife, and other people think it's empowering and a choice. How do you feel about some females' desire to be feminine, and then their sense that that feminism pressures them to be alpha.
Yes, again, I think some feminisms do. I've certainly been at the receiving end of that. But again, many feminisms really challenge that. I think particularly we call it the third wave, which I don't know if I like that term, but younger feminisms, say the feminisms of the millennials, absolutely would challenge that. There is a celebration of female difference. There is a celebration of women in many different spaces and ways. So there's a celebration of what we call in academe intersectionality, a heavy term, but it simply means celebrating women across differences, how women want to live as women, is theirs to define. And I think the difference is it male, are the women making those decisions? If a woman decides to, wear high heel shoes and go to work, then all the power to her. But if she's told she has to by her boss, and we certainly know professions even today, I hear from women quite frequently that they're required to wear low-cut tops or short skirts or high heels in certain jobs, and that's dictated by management. Well, that's simply not okay, clearly. So if it's the woman's choice to celebrate who she is and how she wants to live in the world, then that's, I think that's what's tricky is teasing out whether it's truly an authentic choice or whether it's something that women have internalized they should do, or whether it's something that women are mandated to do. But yeah, it's there, but I think most feminists would debunk that and make it possible for women, to live as they wish to live, if it's their own choice and from their own agency.
So, but not a Stepford wife where you're forced to do that.
No, absolutely. I don't think any feminist, I would hope any thinking person would want that either, right? Stepford Wives, a fabulous movie, resonates even today, not the remake, but the original. But yeah, certainly, who would want to be married to a person like that? Who would want to live like that?
But and maybe this is an old generation long ago, but my mother graduated gold medalist in her class from University of Toronto in 1950 something or other. So she was pretty smart, but she chose to stay at home and be mom, and I'm thankful for that. And my memory, maybe this isn't true, but my memory is that she got dressed up every night for dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Is that wrong?
No, it's not wrong. I mean, that was very much an era. We always kind of go back to that era. It was a very short-lived era. Post-war 45 to 46. That by the by the 60s had become, even by then, not doable. And and I would say in my teaching, I teach a course at York, which I've taught for decades, on mothering and motherhood, and we look at motherhood historically. At the beginning of the course, from agricultural times, in the 1700s to contemporary times today. And the period after the war, when mothers were at home, was very short-lived. It was about 15 or 20 years. And I always remind my students, it was for a very few. I mean, if you looked at television, you would think every family lived that way. That's simply not true. It was very much the exception, not the norm. It was, very much urban or suburban, white, middle class, heterosexual, married, that many working class, racialized, immigrant, poor, young families, the mothers were working in the 50s and 60s. They were, but we don't have television shows about them, right? So in our memory, that's how we remember the 1950s and 60s as, the Leave It to Beaver. I'm not saying, I grew up like that too. I'm not saying families didn't, but they weren't the all as we assume them to be. And a lot of women, there wasn't a choice for those women to work outside the home. Maybe they didn't want to, maybe they did. We don't really know. I mean, some do. We've interviewed them, obviously. But there wasn't the infrastructure then for those women to combine work and motherhood. It's hard enough today in 2024. It's probably almost impossible, in the 50s and 60s for white middle-class women to enter the labor force. Who would mind the kids, who would be home with them when they were ill? And certainly there wasn't shared parenting in the 1950s and 60s, as we hope there is today, with the fathers doing their equal part in changing nappies. I mean, I know fathers that bragged in the 50s and 60s that they never changed a diaper, and they were proud of that. And I thought, oh, how I don't know if a father would say that today. I would hope not. But yeah, men in the 50s, 60s never changed a nappy, never burped a baby. Well, of course, women couldn't work outside the home if there wasn't that equality in their homes.
I changed lots of diapers, and I did the middle of the night feedings, and
good. And I think men today are, yeah. I mean, I and today certainly, I think. I mean, I know millennial dads are having their babies now, and we see far more equity than we would have seen with fathers in the 50s, 60s, and even into the early 70s.
Fascinating conversation tonight, everyone, with Dr. Andrea O'Reilly. She's a professor, School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. We're talking about feminism and motherhood, and are they opposites, or are they something that you can do both of? Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes after some messages with Dr. Andrea O'Reilly from York University. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having an interesting conversation tonight about feminism and motherhood, and whether they're the same and can and they can exist together, or whether they're opposites and antithetical. That's a terrible word. I can't get it. Antithetical to each other or not. My guest is Dr. Andrea O'Reilly. She's a professor, the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, the coordinator of the Bridging Program for Women at York University in Toronto. She's an author of over 30 books. Dr. O'Reilly has published books on motherhood, including Maternal Theory, Essential Reading, Feminist Parenting, Perspectives from Africa and Beyond, Mothering, and COVID-19. One interesting one I want to ask her about: monstrous mothers, troubling tropes, maternal regret, resistances, renunciations, and reflections, normative motherhood, etc. She's the editor of the Encyclopedia on Motherhood, the co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Motherhood, a co-author of Motherhood, The Politics of the Heart, Rocking the Cradle, Thoughts on Motherhood, Feminism, and the Possibility of Empowered Mothering, and, as we've talked about, Matricentric Feminism. She's presented at over 100 conferences worldwide, and most importantly, because I really respect really good educators, she's twice been the recipient of York University's Professor of the Year Award for Teaching Excellence, and is the 2019 recipient of the Status of Women in Equity Award of Distinction from the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations. Wow. And right now, you're getting funding for some research on millennial moms and mothers in returning to normal, the impact of the pandemic on mothering and families. You've got really quite the impressive background, Dr. O'Reilly. Tell me, if you could, just take a step back. How'd you get involved in being a professor of motherhood?
That's a question I'm asked, and rightly so. It came from us, I think, most of our passions from personal experience. I was doing my bachelor's of English and Women's Studies at York University in 1983, and I was dating a quite nice fellow. I was planning to go to do my master's in English. I had my life all planned, as you tend to do when you're 22 years old. And then I found out I wasn't late, I was pregnant. So I found myself pregnant in my 4th year of my honors BA. And it certainly wasn't planned. We were dating, and I was, as I said, poor, as you are as a student, you're poor. You're taking each day at a time. And my partner and I sat down and said, okay, we're going to have this baby. And that baby actually will be 40 in July. And I'm still with the fellow 42 years later. And we went on to have 2 more children, both of them also not planned. One was during my master's, and one was during my PhD. So yes, it came out of my own lived experience. When I became pregnant, what I noticed, and I hadn't noticed before, that's what was so interesting, that none of the courses I were taking or had taken in women's studies were about motherhood. And by that point, I'd taken 20 full courses, or 40 half courses. And you would think that, of course, all these courses I'd taken, motherhood would have been touched upon. It was a little bit, perhaps, but it certainly was never central to the research and the books I was studying and reading. And when it was discussed, it often tended to be dismissive, or that motherhood was oppressive, don't do it. So from that, I went on and said, well, we got to talk about this. Why aren't we talking about this? How do we talk about this? And then, it all began then. And, lots of things happened. I developed the first course on motherhood in North America in 1990 that I've now been teaching for 3 decades. I went on to publish many books. I went on to start a research center, a journal, and then a publishing company. And I always, remember I did my dissertation on Toni Morrison. I always remember her words. She said, I wrote the books I needed to read. And I think I did the research that I needed, that I didn't have when I, now, 40 years ago. So it came out of a lived need and a lived passion.
So I apologize, I'm not familiar with Toni Morrison. Tell me about her, and why did you choose her to be the subject of your dissertation?
Toni Morrison passed away 3 years ago, but she's an African American writer, and arguably, I don't think too many people would argue she's certainly the top, one of the best. I mean, people say she's the best writer of the 20th century in the US. Some people might say she's the third best writer, but she went on to write 10 novels. She's won the Pulitzer, she's won the Nobel. And she writes about Black mothering, which I spent a lot of, even though I'm obviously not a Black woman, I spent a lot of time studying African American mothering or Black mothering more generally. And she talks about how Black mothers have been obviously oppressed because of slavery and racism, but then she talks about how Black mothering can be a site of empowerment, can be a site of political activism, can be a site of social change. And her works really radicalized me because even though I'm not Black, evidently, I still believe fundamentally that motherhood is a site of empowerment, is a site of activism, can be a site of social change, that, we see motherhood conservatively or apolitically or privately, but I see motherhood as profoundly and political, that if we harness that and recognize it, mothers can, the hand that rocks the cradle can, I believe, change the world. And Toni Morrison was an African-American writer that talked about that in her novels. So that's why I was drawn very much to her work as a PhD student.
Did you consider, taking a break from your career and just being a stay-at-home mom, or did you always, continue the combination of pregnancy and motherhood and master's, PhD, and professorship?
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I may have done it if I could have. It wasn't a choice. My partner was also doing his PhD. I was doing my PhD. I had a TA-ship, not a lot of money, but some money. I also had a scholarship. I had a quite prestigious Ontario graduate scholarship. And had I stepped away from my studies, I would have lost that. Even more shocking, I would have lost my housing. You could only live where I lived if you were a student. I would have had to pay back my student loan immediately. I wouldn't have had any access to childcare, even part-time. So it was a necessity. I obviously loved what I did, but my partner did not make enough money to support me and my kids and then children. So I worked like most women work because I had to financially. I mean, I loved it, but being a student enabled me, to have housing, enabled me to get grant funding, enabled me to have student loans and so on. So even part-time studies was not an option. Now that I disagreed with, I thought that had some success, but we couldn't even go part-time as students back in the day. If you went part-time, you lost your housing, you lost your fellowship, you lost your childcare, you lost your student loans, and so forth. So full-time was pushed on me whether I wanted it or not. I probably would have liked to go part-time, but that was not something that was available to me. So yeah, it was rough doing a PhD. I started my PhD when my son was just turned 2 and I was 6 months pregnant, and there were no maternity leaves. I had my daughter December 30th, and I was back in class on January 2nd, January 3rd. So I would have liked a maternity leave certainly, but York didn't offer them back then. Now they do. It was my case actually that changed Senate policy, but so yeah, it was something that I did out of passion, but also out of necessity.
Where do you think feminism is today? We've had the sort of the sexual revolution of the 60s, the pill, a fight over abortion that's gone both ways, back and forth with, at least in the United States, with Roe v. Wade, and then the elimination of Roe v. Wade. Some people think feminism has made great strides, and other people say that when you've got someone that is the leading candidate for president that is guilty of sexual assault, that in the Me Too movement would have been deemed completely inappropriate. Frankly, would have for a lot of people always been deemed inappropriate. That the double standard still exists dramatically and astounding that people are supporting. So where are we today from a feminism standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard and good question. Of course, feminisms are different. Even I would say even the feminisms we have in Canada from the United States, that would be very different, obviously, from Europe or Australia or what have you. I think we need feminism more than ever right now because of the world we're living in, right? Because of people like, I won't dare not say his name, south of the border. We need feminism more today. Women's rights are far more under erosion. I think it's, we've lost so much in the last few decades. Now we've gained a lot too, but we know our hard-won gains, we can't take them for granted, as we've seen south of the border. And there's, I think there's, worse to come. So I think we need feminism even more today. And we need different types of feminism, obviously. As I talked about earlier, I believe we need a mother-centered feminism to put women's needs, concerns on the, on the public agenda. I think we need more intersectional feminisms that address differences, across race and class and sexuality. We know that. So yeah, I think feminism is needed more today. More complicated, I agree, but I think so much more urgently needed. Because of everything, right? Rise of AI, climate change. We are really in a really, they call it an existential moment. I don't know if I like that term, but we are really in the crossroads right now, as a species, as a planet, as a people. And I think we need some real, a lot of activism. And one of them, I think, would center and needs to continue centering on women.
Being at a crossroads is a very strong language to use. Why do you think we're at a crossroads as a species?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on this by any means. My company, I run Demeter Press, I shouldn't say company, my publishing place. We actually are working on a book on mothering and climate change. I think, we know that that's not my expertise, but as you mentioned earlier, I'm starting a project. I've just starting it on millennial mothers. And I've done a bit of research. I've talked to, other people who are doing this research. And I think, millennial moms are kind of grappling things that I certainly didn't grapple with having children in the 80s. A real fear of what's happening, right? In terms of continuing global inequities, in terms of climate change, in terms of, AI. What does it mean to raise, and, the increasing problems of social media? What does it mean to raise a child? I mean, it's always been, every generation has its challenges. I'm not that naive. You had a child during the wars, the Depression, of course. But I think we really are at a point that we don't, I think even then we believe there was a future. I'm talking millennial moms today and don't know if there's a future for their children. And how do you raise children knowing that? And how do you prepare children for a world that is so much at risk in a way that perhaps it never has been? And other people would say it has been, but millennial moms, I think, are taking on and mothering in a way that is, needs to be studied, and obviously, but also needs to be recognized as, I think, a particular moment in history.
You say that, and it may be true, but then at the same time, sort of the number one policy that our premier is using is fight the tax in regards to any kind of carbon tax. And so it would appear that there's a whole bunch of people out there that really don't believe that climate change is either real or is so important that you've got to actually take aggressive action against it.
Yeah, and I think that's not going to change. I mean, we are a democracy, and everybody has different views, and I don't think the well-viewed world will all agree on anything, whether what that anything may be. But I think in terms of age, I do think younger people. I mean, the evidence is there. Younger people are more aware of these issues and believe in these issues far more than older people do, right? Maybe because they have to. They're going to be living in this changed world. Well, we probably won't be. So yes, I mean, younger people tend to be more progressive. They tend to be more, aware of climate change and willing to, to support initiatives that deal with climate change in a way that older generations do not. So we have that divide. We'll always have that divide in people's politics and beliefs. So yeah, that's not my area, but I do think that is something that is becoming a part of, the world in which we live. That's yet another thing that mothers, are living with and engaged with. And a lot of mothers, millennial mothers, that is very much impacting or shaping how they're raising their children.
Really? How do they raise their children differently?
Well, I mean, again, it's really new because millennial moms are just starting to have their babies. If you think millennials are basically anyone born between 81 and 96, I think roughly is what we agree upon, though obviously a bit flexible to either end. How they're raising children. Are they engaging in, firmer green mothering? That's a term that's coming out now, that they are, using perhaps disposable diapers, not using disposable diapers, rather using cloth, not, buying secondhand clothing, raising children in more collective arrangements, shared households, all that stuff. to reduce their carbon footprint as parents is certainly being talked about widely in social media. And it, again, that's not my generation, so I'm an observer, not a participant in those discussions because my children are raised. But they're having conversations that I certainly would never have had in the 1980s.
Well, and they're probably talking about your grandchildren, or at least potentially about your grandchildren.
Yes, and we are seeing that too. You're right. My children do not have children, but certainly some of my friends are at that. They're now having the grandbabies, and certainly I think being a grandparent now will be different than it would have been even 10, 20, 30 years ago.
We're chatting tonight with Dr. Andrea O'Reilly. She's a professor at the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. She's internationally recognized as the founder of the discipline of motherhood studies and has defined and developed a specific feminism for mothers, Matricentric feminism. We're going to take a break for some messages, and we're going to come back in 2 minutes. And I'm going to ask Professor O'Reilly about a couple of different issues and see what she says, see if we've made progress. Stay with us, everyone. Interesting conversation tonight about women and motherhood. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is feminism and motherhood. And do they go together or not? And our guest is Dr. Andrea O'Reilly. She's the professor at the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. She's written over 30 books. She's a publisher, Demeter Press. She's the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Motherhood. And as I mentioned, she's written numerous different books. Dr. O'Reilly, you've been recognized twice as Professor of the Year Award. Congratulations. Why?
Thank you.
Why do you win those awards? Why are you such a compelling professor?
Well, thank you. I hope I am. I've been doing this for a very long time. I've been teaching. My first class was in 1985 as a teaching assistant. So a very, very long while. Why do I mean, I think I'm good at it because I love it. It might be kind of cliched and reductionist, but I teach from passion, and I teach from politics, and I teach from purpose. And I believe in what I teach, extends beyond the classroom. I don't tell my students, I tell them something evidently, but I convey knowledge, but that's not my job as a teacher. My job is for my students to think and to ask really hard questions. So I hope at the end of my course that my students perhaps walk out perhaps knowing less than they should, but knowing that they need to know more and to ask those hard questions, and to think critically, and to make things, alive and not irrelevant and redundant. Academia can be pretty dull and tedious and boring. And it doesn't have to be. It should be exciting and fascinating and invigorating. And I try to make that in my classrooms. I really try to tell a lot of stories. My PhD's in English. So when I'm teaching a really hard theory, my students kind of glaze over, and I'll have 100 of them and I can see it. So I step back and I tell the story, and sometimes I make it personal, make it real. And then my students kind of go, oh, I get it now, right? So to make it, I don't know what the word is, but to make it not abstract and irrelevant to their lives, but to make it matter, and that they care about what is being taught, and that they will take that, learn from it, and use it in their own lives, whichever way they find fitting.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I guess I am. Can you give us an example? What kind of a story would you use in a lecture?
Oh gosh, I mean, I use a lot from my own mothering, and I tell stories about, a lot of people talk about, let's say maternal burnout or something, or the maternal wall, and these concepts. I mean, I think they're quite self-evident, but students, well, what do you mean? What do you mean by the maternal wall? Like, what does that mean? And it's a concept in motherhood studies, which means, we used to say the sticky floor and the glass ceiling is what held women back, right? Women were prevented from promotions because of sexism. And so it's called the sticky floor, the glass ceiling. We know those terms, which is true, but more and more research has shown in the last, it's been 3 decades now, wouldn't it be, that actually it's not being so much a woman that's hindering women's career advancement, it's being a mother. And the evidence is pretty compelling. One stat that's come out it's been come out and then refined with each year, that the disparity in pay is not between men and women anymore. We've almost closed the gap in the professions, at least. The disparity now is between mothers and non-mothers. So it's huge. So mothers are making far less than non-mothers. Okay. So I talk about all this about maternal wall, and that means that women are prevented from advancement because of a wall, and it's maternal wall. It's Joan Williams' turn, who's an American sociologist. So just as an example, students are like, what do you mean the wall? What are you talking about? And I just say, well, you have a child, let's say, and now I use something from my personal experience. You have a kid, and your boss says, oh, to get that advancement, you have to go to 3 conferences in the next 6 weeks. Well, what if you can't go? What if your partner can't stay home with the kid? What if the kid gets sick? What you can't bring your kid with you? You've been told you can't do that. So what are you going to do? Well, you may not go to those conferences. Well, then guess what? You don't get the promotion. Or, there's a very important meeting that you must attend, and you can't attend because your child's been, the daycare is called and said Johnny's sick, and you're like, oh gosh, and you run home to get Johnny. Well, guess what? You get demoted. So I tell stories, and students go, yeah, that's right, I get it. Well, that shouldn't happen. That's wrong. A woman shouldn't be, demoted because her kid was sick. That's unfair. And I go, well, yeah, that's unfair, but it happens every single day. So again, that's maternal wall. I mean, I think it's a pretty straightforward concept, maybe because I've lived it. But to a 20-year-old, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So if I give them really concrete examples how mothers experience discrimination in the workforce, they go, oh, yeah. And then what's interesting, they start seeing it. They can't then not see it. They watch a movie and go, gosh, that happened to that mother. Didn't we learn that in class? That's wrong. Or their mother shares a story, or their mother, certainly then it resonates. So that's what I try to make it real, make it grounded, make it gritty, make it tactile, rather than this, kind of abstract concept that we academics tend to, think too much that way.
So, this is really interesting. I think I'm a reasonably well-read individual. I read newspapers every day. I watch way too much news on TV. I interview people on a fairly regular basis. I've never heard this concept before that you've just explained, that the wage gap isn't between men and women. It's between women that are mothers and women that aren't mothers, and that the male-female wage gap, other than women that are mothers, has been bridged. How come I've never heard that before? Is this just a brand new idea, or is it not something that people publicize?
Well, that's why we need the work I do, motherhood studies, matricentric feminism. Yes, I mean, I think it got talked about a bit during the pandemic, because there we saw it, literally writ large. We couldn't turn away. The cameras were in our homes, and we saw the impact being a mother who was having a women's career, and how it was negatively impacting her career advancement, and how many women had to step away from their careers because of the pandemic and homeschooling and all like that, lack of childcare. So the pandemic, we started having those conversations, and people started realizing that mothers, far more than fathers, were being penalized because of the care work they had to do. And then that conversation stopped, unfortunately, when the pandemic, I don't think it's ended, but when it no longer had our media attention. You can Google it. Lots of economists know this. Now, the wage gap is still there. I don't want to ever say it isn't there. And we know there's wage gaps across race, too. I don't ever want to minimize that. We know that, Black men make less than white men. We know that. And so, but I'm just saying what isn't really talked about is the wage gap between mothers and non-mothers. And, what I've read, it's been number crunched, and it's reliable data. And it makes sense in many ways, because if you're a woman and you're in good health, you're not disabled, and you're white, you can probably play and act like a guy and not experience discrimination. You might experience sexual discrimination. I'm not naive, but a lot of, Anne Crittenden wrote a book that's quite old now, but she said, women under 35 think that, all the gains of feminism have been achieved. And then she says they become a mother, and, the egalitarian work party is over, and that's why I think becoming a mother is so radicalizing, because so many women, they're just living their lives, and yes, they are discriminated against, arguably, but it's when becoming a mother that they realize, full throttle, how much oppression and discrimination is out there that they might not have seen or experienced as an unencumbered, woman. It's only when they become a mother that they can, I always say, you can see patriarchy in its most manifest, perhaps nastiest form when you become a mother. And lots of, the book, Coming Into Being, that I published this year, on mothers finding and realizing feminism. I don't know how many there's in that book, 25 contributors from around the world. They all said the same thing. It was when they became a mother that they became a feminist, right? I mean, they might have been a feminist before, but motherhood made feminism not just real, but more necessary for mothers. And again, we don't think that. We think being a mother is not being a feminist. But from this book and my other research, quite the contrary is true. Becoming a mother solidified their feminism, or even brought them to feminism.
You said just a few seconds ago that that's when they became aware of the patriarchy more than they may have been aware of the patriarchy before. I've heard the opposite from some new moms, and they've said that the biggest opposition they get is from other females. Either it's the females that are feminists in the workplace that call them a sellout because they decided to stay home and or have kids. And then they also got opposition from other moms that, criticized that they didn't spend enough time with their kids, or they were working or putting them in daycare, and that they weren't, good enough as moms.
Yeah, I mean, again, that, we call that the mummy wars. That's been kind of going on now, 3 decades. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it isn't true, but I think it's been very much a media creation about these mothers hating each other and at each other. Yeah, I'm sure it happens. But the reality is, I think most mothers are in both camps. We've all been stay-at-home mothers, right? We've all been stay-at-home for part of our lives because we're home after having our babies during our mat leave in Canada. So we've all been stay-at-home moms. And most of us have been working moms. Every mother works. I mean, whether she works for pay might be another matter, but I remember when I was having my kids, I was in school, so I must have been one of those working moms. But my friends were those stay-at-home moms, and we got along. It was, we helped each other out. But what I realized, those stay-at-home moms I was at home more than those stay-at-home moms because I was at home, writing, and my kid might have been at my feet, but I was home, but I was writing. And those moms were at-home moms, but they were so active in a beautiful, positive way. It's mothers that are keeping, our cultures, societies going. They're the ones who are doing the breakfast club. They're the ones going on the field trips. They're the ones, doing recess supervision. And I remember one friend, she was away from her kids more than I was. And she was a stay-at-home mom because she was an activist, because she didn't volunteer work, right? So I think it's a false dichotomy. I really do. If you actually sit down with a bunch of women, yeah, probably some are back talking about others. She spends too much time at home. She doesn't spend enough time with her kids. But I don't think that's happening in most living rooms with mothers. I think most of us, are in the trenches together, and we've both been working and we've both been at home, and we all both know how hard it is and what choice you may make. That isn't to say that there's some nasty women out there who might be judging at-home moms, or other nasty women who might be judging stay-at-home or working moms. But I think generally it's been really a media construction, these mummy wars. And a lot of women internalize, anti-motherhood views, anti-female views. They might be women, but they're talking like a patriarch, right? So
They might be women, but they're talking like a patriarch. That's interesting.
They internalize those values too, right? I mean, I know a lot of women, no, I shouldn't say it, but I know some women who do believe stay-at-home moms are lazy and, selfish and, aren't contributing. Well, yeah, but that's not true. We know that. And they've internalized those mother-hating, mother-blaming narratives of our dominant culture, and they're spewing them out, right? Just like men can spew them out. Women aren't, immune to that, right? They can internalize those really hateful messages and transmit them.
We're going to have to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've had a really interesting conversation, at least I've enjoyed it, with Dr. Andrea O'Reilly. She's the professor at the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. We've been talking about motherhood. We've been talking about feminism. We've been talking about whether they're consistent or opposite. We've talked about a really new concept that I hadn't heard about the wall, that wage gaps between men and women may not exist to the same extent that they the media believes they do, but it really happens. It exists between mothers and the balance of the people in the workforce. Dr. O'Reilly, I got to ask you one final important question to me. Can you have it all if you're a female?
I would ask the same question to men. Can you have it all as a man? I just put it right back there. And I don't mean to be facetious or rhetorical, but we only ask women that question, which I find so frustrating. We should be able to have it all as people, maybe not all at the same time. But nor maybe men can't have it at all at the same time either. That's, our lives are long in many ways, but they're short in other ways. And maybe certain points of your life, you pull back from your career a little bit. And other parts of your life, you ramp it up, right? But that's what we both should be doing as fathers and mothers. We should be looking at the needs of our children. And when they're young, they probably need more of our time and care. Yes. When they're maybe even 8 or 9, they're closing the bedroom door and they're saying, Mom, Dad, leave me alone. I'm chatting with my friend. And then when they're teenagers, then they, create their own lives. So yes, we can have it all. If we live in a society that truly supports and empowers and cares about parents and children, and we create a world where that question wouldn't exist in 5 years. That's my dream, that we'd never even ask that question, that we live in a society to make that happen.
From a political standpoint, it almost seems like we've had the pendulum go back, and abortion rights, opposition towards drag queens, presidential candidates that are found guilty of sexual assault, et cetera, et cetera. Is feminism, are you optimistic about feminism, or are you pessimistic about feminism today?
Oh, I'm optimistic. We have to be. We, as I said earlier, we just so urgently, desperately, need feminism more than ever. We've probably said that in many moments in our history. There'll always be those people. I mean, when I was younger, I used to always believe if I just talk to these people, they'll change their mind. Any right person, of course, would be pro-choice. Any normal person would care about children and support mothers. Any normal person would care about our environment. I just need to talk to them. Well, I realize in my in my aging years that that's not true. Some people are going to kick their beliefs. I could talk to them and talk to them and talk. They're not going to change their mind. They're going to continue to be racist and sexist and homophobic and climate deniers. There's nothing I can do about that. I can hopefully, and in my classroom, I know I make change. I certainly do. I have students come into my classroom who I would say are anti-feminists, anti-mothers, and they leave a very transformed person. So you can, of course, raise consciousness, get people to think differently about topics. But at the end of the day, there's some people you're not going to change their minds. So are we going to waste our energy on those people? No. We're going to try to create a world that, at the best that we can do. But ultimately, I think the general population, maybe not so much in some places in the world, but I think in Canada, I'm hoping the majority of people do care about children, do care about mothers, do care about families, and we'll create a world that better supports those families in all kinds of different ways.
Dr. Andrea O'Reilly, professor at the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, York University, and author of over 30 books. Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And it's given me a new appreciation for some of the challenges that women, particularly mothers, are facing in the world today. Thank you. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are available after the radio airs at briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody. Thank you.